in New York, when you count the number of companies that are traded there, the ranking is the United States #1, China #2, Israel #3. It's another one of those word association games, right? It's a totally obvious pattern, right? US, China, Israel, the big three. Huh? Okay, it doesn't make sense, but that's the ranking in New York in terms of stock market representation. So why is it? Well, if this was about 10 or 20 years ago and there were more Yiddish speakers and there was someone who was maybe over the age of 80 or 85 in the audience, they would have raised their hand and they would have said, a Yiddish kop. This is a Yiddish kop. And I would have walked over to the person and I would have given them a big hug and say, I love you, you're totally wrong. Because a Yiddish kop is not enough, okay? Brains are all over the place. If you've seen some of the data about Korean and Asian kids in US colleges and universities and how they're testing, you'll realize that we have no monopoly on brains. And if you've seen the Israeli PISA test scores of how Israeli kids stack up against the rest of the world, it's positively frightening. Okay, Israelis are thoroughly mediocre in terms of our average test scores. Hard to believe, Jews, but it's true. Okay, we have a lot of geniuses, but we have a lot of mediocre people, and our test scores aren't that great. So it's not about brains. Brains are necessary, but not sufficient. Right? You need more than brains. And what you need is a culture that encourages this kind of entrepreneurial thinking and activity. And the culture starts off with an attitude towards risk. And it's, by the way, not just an Israeli culture, it's a Jewish culture. We live with existential risk. But the reality is somehow you'd think that the Jewish people or the people of Israel would be devastated by this kind of risk. How do you wake up in the morning and read about President Whackjob in Tehran wanting to wipe you off the face of the earth? Okay, threatening to bring a second Holocaust when he doesn't even believe there was a first one. Okay, it's you know, and he says, I'll wipe you off the map. We're not on his map to begin with. Okay, I mean, the reality is you can either cry or laugh or both. But that's what Jews do, is we cry and we laugh. Okay, and somehow we have some secret sauce about dealing with risk. Call it emunah, call it, you know, Rabbi Nachman, kol ha'olam kulo, gesher tzal ma'od, v'ala'ikar zelo lefakad klal. Okay, so you just can't be afraid. We're all here for a short period of time. Are you going to live your life afraid? And somehow Israel and the Jews have transcended this sense of existential risk. And when you compare this to starting up a company, and God forbid taking some investment and failing, even if it's massive like Better Place, so what? It's part of the game. Everybody fails. Every great team fails. You can be Arsenal, or you can be the Spurs, or whoever you like, or Chelsea, or I'm missing the Jewish team, or Manchester City, you know, right? Whatever it is, they all fail at some point. But you get over it, and that kind of risk doesn't compete with our sense of existential risk. And for many societies, they don't get this at all. I mean, in some places of the world, you start up a company and you fail, get out of town. Your life is over. You are a loser. And in Israel, and among Jews even, you know, it's part of the game. Great fortunes are made, great fortunes are lost, you make it again. That's what happens. So this is a secret, it's a blessing. And by the way, it's a blessing that we have, you know, from Mikorot. There's a second blessing here, which is that we are a diverse people. And we've always been a diverse people. The reality is that if you all think alike and you do alike, you don't create startups. You need that arguing, that tumult, the Jewish sort of questioning for it to happen. And it turns out that in Silicon Valley, the great companies are not being built by Wilson and Jones. They're being built by someone who's an immigrant from Russia or China, because immigrants make great entrepreneurs. Why do immigrants make it happen? And by the way, it's not just the immigrants themselves, it's their children and their grandchildren. Most of us here are either children or grandchildren of immigrants if we're not an immigrant ourselves. And that person was the CEO of mylife.com. It was a startup, right? It was take risk and go to a foreign country and get funding and handle legal and deal with HR and banking and all the stuff you have to do for a company. So it turns out that that kind of a nature of what Israel is, and by the way, everybody thinks Israel's a white country and that Israel is monolithic, and they couldn't be farther from the truth. The majority of Jews in Israel today are Afro-Asian. I want to, there's another little tidbit you need to have. The majority of Jews in Israel today are Afro-Asian. There are about 800,000 Jews from Morocco and a couple 100,000 from Libya and Tunisia and 100,000 from Egypt and 200,000 each from Iran and Iraq. And there are about 200,000 from Yemen, and we have 100,000 from Bukhara. We all know who Bukhara is. When I talk to other audiences, they look and say, Bukhara, what's that? Sounds like some kind of disease. Okay, it's Samarkand. We're 100,000 from the Kafkaz, okay, which is Baku, the mountain Jews. We have 100,000 from Georgia, and they're not from Atlanta. Okay, they're from Georgia. Okay, we have 75,000 Indian Jews today. You can get good, kosher Indian food in Israel. Thank God, Baruch Hashem, that's a very important thing, okay? And it's just this kind of diversity is really a driver for this. And then ultimately, we have to give thanks and credit to the Jewish mothers, because it's not just what they do to bring up our generations, but in Israel today, the Jewish mother has got it. They've moved on from I want my kid to be a doctor or a lawyer, which was last generation. The next generation was I want my daughter or son to be an investment banker or a hedge fund manager. And today it's, I want my kid to be a startupist, okay? I want him to set up a startup. And if you think I'm wrong, go to Israel. Because today in Israel, every time one of these companies is bought, one of these 50 companies, basically they publish a little table of who gets the money, right? So-and-so sold their company for $100 million, and then there's the table. And it says Yossi gets 10 million, and Shlomo gets 5 million. And of course, Menachem, who was the big boss, gets 20. And Menachem has a friend from the army named Pinny, and Pinny's mother reads the table. And she gets on the phone to Pinny, and she says, do you see what Menachem made? $20 million? And you're working at Intel, and I'm going to die old and poor? Okay, why aren't you building a startup? And the whole country is going this way. And if you think I'm wrong, just check it out, because it's actually happening.